Well, hi everyone. My name is Jonas Moberg, and huge welcome. And it's great to see so many friends from so many different places, from law firms, from large-scale developers, from hosting governments, and from many international organizations, development banks, and others. You're really, really welcome. And this is precisely the kinds of things that we at the Green Hydrogen Organization want to do. Essentially, try to make sure that we work together, that we share information. And many of you, we are also incredibly grateful for your support so far. And this kickoff of this webinar series is, in a sense, the end of the first part or the beginning of the second phase, whichever way. So I can see, as I mentioned, Birgitte from Schött. I think we have colleagues from Herbert Smith Freehills, from Curtis, and so on these calls. And we are incredibly grateful to all of you, because what you have been doing over the last year or so actually is, of course, to help develop a set of papers that we have been sharing, and I've got many of them here on these various topics: fiscal regimes, on dispute resolution, fiscal terms and financing, and so on. And I think we have a really great body of good practices, of ways of addressing a number of issues as we grow the large-scale renewable green hydrogen economy. Now we need to continue this work. We need to share all of this, and we need to continue in the focus on becoming more detailed and more practical. So in a sense, we hope that as this part of, if you like, rolling out a lot of these good practices, it will to a large extent also be a process of moving from principles, from general points, to becoming increasingly specific, dealing with particular issues and so on. We have, many of us that have been part of this journey of this year have energy background, mining, minerals and metals background. And I think that it's quite clear that one way to look at what we're doing together is, in a sense, learning from oil, gas and mining, or if you like, trying to make sure that we don't make the mistakes that we have sometimes been part of in other sectors. So that's also something that we hope is a driver in what we're doing. So this is obviously the first of these 6 seminars, and this one will be a little bit by necessity general to introduce it. We recognize that some of you are quite into the weeds of these topics. For some, it's the first time. So you have to forgive us a little bit in that sense, that we are a bit general to start with, but over the coming months and the various seminars, we hope to become, as I've said, ever more detailed. Today, we're going to first hear from Ines, that will very quickly identify the different work streams. And then we will have a discussion where we'll hear from Mahmoud, who's a lawyer working in Egypt and has done a lot of things together with the government there, and from Don Hubert, who has extensive experience on fiscal regimes, and then we'll, based on that, have a bit of a discussion. Please also, if there are things that you come across, either that you have questions about or papers you wish to share or so, by all means use the chat function. This is really to make sure that we learn as quickly as possible from all of us. Unless there are any quick questions now, I'll hand over to you, Ines.
Thank you. Great. So what I'll do, I'll share some insights from the guidance that's being released over the coming months. As Jonas says, we'll be delving deeper into these issues together with legal experts and practitioners, and hopefully many of you. Jonas already touched a bit on the need to get the legal and fiscal terms right from the outset to enable green hydrogen project development in a fast and responsible way. The relevant legal frameworks differ obviously across jurisdictions, and some markets are more regulated than others. In particular, in emerging economies, we see that governments and project developers sign MOUs and framework agreements while developing necessary regulations and permitting procedures in parallel. In countries where there isn't yet a clear legal framework, contracts are likely to form the main legal and fiscal conditions for a project, and in some cases, these contracts can be long-term and last decades, 40 years, for instance, in the case of Namibia. So as you see here in this visual, the guidance focuses on the legal obligations between host country and project developers, while also touching on financing and ownership structures, which involve shareholders and investors, and terms related to offtake. This is, of course, all interconnected. So I'll try to highlight some key insights from the wealth of guidance, starting with fiscal regimes. Obviously, IRA in the US is game-changing in offering fiscal incentives, and expectations are also high of contracts for different regimes having been announced in Europe. Over time, fiscal terms and financial benefits for host governments are likely to receive more attention from the public as the green hydrogen projects become profitable. And at the moment, there is very limited public information about the fiscal terms that apply, and the lack of these real-life examples and benchmarks make it difficult for governments to sign an agreement with confidence that it is a good deal for the country in the long term. So should we be looking at the oil and gas industry, for example? Should the government secure benefits through corporate income tax, equity participation, carried interest, even royalties? What mechanisms will really allow governments to capture a share of the upside while incentivizing investment from the private sector? These are key questions that I don't want to preempt as part of the discussion, but Don will share a bit more further ideas for how to design fit-for-purpose fiscal regimes. Access to land and infrastructure are other topics that we know we need to get right from the outset. We hear that project developers need more clarity on approvals and permits related to access to land. We also hear that challenges often arise related to payment obligations and exclusivity entitlements. And it's important that payment obligations for project developers should not be prohibitive in their pre-feasibility stages to encourage investment and into research. And governments, on the other hand, might also avoid granting exclusive rights to potential projects that can end up being behind schedule and block access to third parties looking to develop other projects. So one way, for instance, that the guidance highlights that to address this is to have clear concession stages reflecting the time needed for pre-feasibility research, and linking concession fees to the size of the concession to incentivize project developers to narrow in on the final site sooner and free up access to the concession area to other potential project developers. Similarly, shared access to infrastructure will also be key to reduce the cost of green hydrogen production and transport. This obviously can include transportation networks, storage facilities, and receiving terminals. And we will need mechanisms to ensure that a sole developer doesn't block access to infrastructure, for instance, a port to future developers, while we still want to incentivize first movers. So government have a key role to play here. As an example, the Belgian government is establishing a hydrogen network operator, which will guarantee non-discriminatory third-party access to its network under regulated and transparent tariffs. Speaking of transparency, we all know that community engagement and support is important for the sustainability of a project. The key challenge is really how we stop just talking about it and start engaging communities very practically and sufficiently early on in the project. We're not starting from scratch here. which are the good news, and there are various standards and community engagement models, for instance, from the oil, gas, and mining industry that we can learn from. An example is from Mauritania, which is a member of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a global transparency and accountability standard in the extractive sector, which is also now looking at expanding its disclosures to cover the green hydrogen industry. And that would include the disclosures on legal and fiscal terms, payments to government, and local community benefits. Another example that we touch on in the guidance are community development agreements, which is an established practice in the mining industry, and it's an agreement between project developers and local communities to agree on the rights and responsibilities of different stakeholders, how to engage over time, managing social impacts, and resolve disputes. Last but not least, a key hurdle to establishing the green hydrogen economy is, of course, the much talked about offtake agreements, which are key for project bankability. These regulate the sale, purchase, and supply of green hydrogen. We are currently developing guidance together with the law firms and a group of project developers on this, and are drawing on concepts from PPAs and gas supply and purchase agreements. We're looking at different pricing options for hydrogen offtake agreements in the absence of an established market price for hydrogen, and price review mechanisms with specific review triggers to avoid disputes. We're also looking at options for regulating a party's obligation to deliver and purchase minimum volumes to give security over time, and also management of project-on-project risks, performance guarantees, and excess hydrogen. I also just wanted to highlight that the guidance also covers options for certifying the green origin of the hydrogen to be delivered. And of course, one of the options that we highlight there is the green hydrogen standard. So that was a very brief, quick presentation, which hopefully gives some context to the following discussion. And yeah, look forward to it. So I hand it back over to you, Jonas.
I think you're on mute. We cannot hear you.
Yes, thank you. We can't hear
Sorry
you,
about
Jonas.
that. Thank you very much. Anyway, that was great, Ines. Thank you so much. Okay, let's, before we open it for a free discussion today, we've asked a couple of people to say a few words. I would like to start by turning to you, Mahmoud Bassini, who's a partner with a law firm, as I mentioned, in Egypt. And there, of course, at COP27 and following that, I think the Egyptian government, we've got Egyptian government representatives actually here, but you're nearly at what, 30 MOUs covering well over $100 billion. And now you've turned a number of those, is it 8 or so, into framework agreements. I'd be interested to hear you address the issue of how do we strike, what do you see as some of the main challenges in terms of legally now moving forward, and how in particular, coming to Ines's last point, do you see that we strike the right balance in these offtakes when it comes to sharing risk between buyers and sellers? Mahmoud, is that a fair challenge?
That's an unfair challenge, but thank you for that, Jonas. No, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this, and thank you, Ines, as well. I mean, we're very honored to have assisted the sponsors, of being the Egyptian government, the Suez Canal Zone, the Egyptian Transmission Company, NREA, the Renewable Energy Authority in Egypt, and the Sovereign Fund of Egypt into those framework agreements that you've mentioned. It was obviously a long way till COP, so we're very happy with the COP signature, and then begins the conversation on the challenge, right? So just to give a bit of a flavor or a bit of a positive spin on that, the positive aspects we have here in Egypt with the program, with the Green Hydrogen program, is that number one, you have the policymakers completely supporting the program and with a high degree of, let's call it a transparent dialogue with the market players. The fundamentals are here. We have an abundant supply of renewable energy sources, being wind or solar. The grid had already been upgraded, and it's already connected to whether the Binban plants or the other big solar wind plants we have. Some incentives have already been put in place. Some tax incentives in the investment law were already in place, specifically targeting green hydrogen players. And we've also been witnessing a huge development of the port sector in Egypt, making the conversation on transportation much easier. Now, the issue we've thought, I've personally experienced as a lawyer working on this, is that, given that I'm a finance projects lawyer, whether the renewable energy program we've worked on, whether the oil and gas concessions we work on, you had, as Ines mentioned, a certain benchmark for the industries. Whereas here we did not have that benchmark, making the conversation with the government, because we were acting as a relay, as an interface between the investor and the government to try to formulate balanced agreements, making it quite difficult, because if you don't have a benchmark, each player comes with its own benchmark. And what complicates even more is that when we say players, it's a bit misleading, because it assumes they all have the same interests and they're all working towards the same goals, whereas they have very different entities that are involved in the green hydrogen production, either for commercial purposes or for all their own personal use purposes, or for in connection with the fertilizer industry and other growing industry in Egypt. So you did not have a unity of players, unlike, for example, the Binban solar power plant, the 2,000 megawatt one. Each one had a 50 megawatt plant. There you had a single off-taker being ETC. So it's very easy to streamline issues like bankability and generally speaking, the commercial equilibrium between the parties. For the green hydrogen, given the diversity of players and given there is no global industry benchmark to speak of, that was really challenging. And obviously the challenge has become much more acute when you go into, let's say, the common issues of stuff like green certification, for example, and how to achieve it, and how can the government make sure that the energy mix on the grid is accountable for. So all of these are issues that we've been encountering, but as you've correctly pointed out in the question, the lack of an industry benchmark, I think is the main challenge. Now, on the positive side, the government and sovereign fund being also that catalyst for investor and that government-owned entity that really understands the investor language and concerns. We've been having very open and transparent dialogues to try to streamline all the concerns we've had from the investors, all their future hopes and dreams with regard to the program, to try to roll out even additional incentives that we're expecting that the government would announce. And we don't expect it to stop there. I mean, there is a general regulatory kind of incentives that we expect to see in place. But then you have, each project will have its own set of challenges that will require some sort of government intervention. So on the positive side, we're really seeing the government being proactive and being very attentive to the investors' concerns in this regard.
Mahmoud, that's great. If I could just follow up with one or two questions. You keep putting the lack of benchmark as a key issue. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on how you think that it's best addressed.
Well, as I was saying, it's best addressed by the dialogue with the investors and with people and organizations such as yours, Jonas, where lessons learned in other jurisdictions need to be transmitted to government, and each investor's legitimate commercial concerns needs to be taken into account. I mean, that's the way we're gonna formulate either our own kind of Egyptian benchmark, or at least we're going to harmonize and align with what's already existing in place and try to adapt it to the Egyptian challenges.
Thank you. That's great. At least on my screen, I have just above you, both on my screen and I guess in other ways as well, Mohammed Hafez from Egyptian Electricity Holding Company. Mohammed, would you like to, given that we've got you here now, would you like to comment on what Mahmoud has just said, or yeah, from the government's side itself?
Thanks, Mr. Jonas. From our experience for such a project, there is a lot of challenges because, as you know, that the project are very complicated. A lot of stakeholder in this agreement. The right structure for contracting will solve a lot of problem. As he said, that there is no experience in what is the best optimization for the role and responsibility of each stakeholder. It will give them more flexibility. This is my opinion.
Thank you. That's helpful. Okay, we'll come back to a number of these issues and open it up in a moment. But before we do so, I wonder if I could turn to you, Don Hubert, who works with Resources for Development. You have a long experience with the Canadian government and later on in terms of working with sovereign wealth funds and others in terms of supporting governments to host large industries like this. And you have indeed written one of the papers that Ines had on her slide called Sustainable Fiscal Regimes for the Development of Green Hydrogen. We have supplied a link, we can do that again. Maybe then, Don, how would you introduce this topic, and are there any key lessons in particular as we're all sort of dying to get faster towards these so far somewhat elusive offtake agreements?
Well, thank you very much, Jonas and Ines, for the invitation to join today, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. The starting point for our work is to assist resource-rich developing country governments to negotiate what we would call durable contracts. And I think that Ines mentioned this at the start, that the contracting periods that we're talking about for multi-billion-dollar energy projects are measured in decades. And it's challenging to design contractual terms and fiscal terms that can last those lengths of time. I think that there is often a challenge that the kind of issues of the day, of the urgency, make it challenging to ultimately anticipate the long-term challenges that might arise. We see that about half of the large-scale green energy projects, green hydrogen projects are being proposed in developing countries. And it's important to recognize that when we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of investment, that these projects rival the size of the economies of the countries that they're being proposed to be developed in. And this creates substantial challenges, we think, for fiscal regimes. And I'm going to say a bit more about what that might mean to have fit-for-purpose fiscal regimes. Our own experience is heavily in energy projects and with lots of experience in liquid natural gas. And we see some important parallels there, also some important differences. And we think that one of the challenges, the initial opening comments about lack of benchmarks in the sector is absolutely right. I think we can draw on some lessons from some other sectors. And then, of course, in some cases, it's going to be unique to the green hydrogen experience. I would also say that we focus very heavily on the export market. And so we're looking at green hydrogen, green ammonia as an export product. I'm going to make comments at three levels. The first one on the need for comprehensive economic analysis, the second on fit-for-purpose fiscal regimes, and finally on the challenges of anticipating future dynamics and future risk. I would say that what comments are going to probably seem self-evident. One of the concerns that we have is that what seems self-evident is often not done in practice. And we see this over and over and over with the government who we assist, that they aren't anticipating the challenges that they might face in the medium and long term. In terms of comprehensive economic analysis, it's already been mentioned. These are incredibly complex projects. They're multidimensional. They have many stakeholders. The only way to get a handle on that kind of economic analysis is through economic modeling. There's lots to be said there about running sensitivity and scenario analysis to anticipate different kinds of alternative futures. It's really important to interrogate the input assumptions. And this goes all the way from financing on the one hand to offtake agreements on the others, but of course, capital and operating costs, and then the fiscal terms that might be applied. Second point, absolutely crucial to understand the commercial structures that are involved. We often see people start to analyze the economics of projects without disentangling who owns which parts of the value chain and how risk and reward is allocated across that value chain. And another comment that we see strong parallels with the liquid natural gas sector is that frequently when people talk about the economics across the value chain, they're using different units, which makes it very difficult to really understand where the money is going across the economic analysis. From our perspective, and we give a short example, a stylized example in the paper that we prepared, starting from the sale of the product and working backwards. And if it's the sale of energy, it's probably in million British thermal units. And then looking at dollar per MMBTU going back across the value chain is one way to easily see from a high level where the money is going to reside. We think that there's important lessons about governments expecting a certain level of detail from the companies as they develop their proposals. Detailed development plans and detailed economic models are things that governments must have access to in order to assess the quality of the proposals and the viability of the projects. But our advice always to governments is to build their own economic models and to have sector-wide models. So they're comparing apples and apples when they look across the different projects that they're negotiating with. Absolutely crucial. Governments need the economic tools in order to analyze their own interests. A few comments then on fit-for-purpose fiscal regimes. It's our experience, and I think it's obvious, that general tax laws are not well designed for multi-billion-dollar investments. We could give many examples where loopholes, where gaps, where inconsistencies in tax law create huge problems for the durability of contracts. And we also see, of course, that in many cases, contracts can contradict tax law, creating long-term problems for the sustainability of the deal. So the emergence of a new sector like this warrants fit-for-purpose fiscal regimes. In terms of investment incentives, we think that there's a pretty clear lesson across multi-billion-dollar energy projects that incentives should be time-bound and governments should cost them out. We frequently see investment incentives being offered without care for the long-term implications for host governments. We would also suggest that we should incentivize good performance. In many cases, investment incentives apply to a company whether the company performs well and meets targets on production, meets targets on profitability or not. And there are ways to do this, particularly around depreciation rules, where if companies perform well, companies benefit and governments benefit. We'd also make a comment about sustainability being linked to some economic benefit for the government right from the outset. We flagged the idea of royalties. Whether those are appropriate or not remains to be seen, but it's important to recognize that the role of a royalty in oil and gas projects has changed fundamentally in the last few decades. It used to be compensation for the sale of a non-renewable resource. But over the last few decades, it's become the only means by which governments secure economic benefits in the early years of a project. And we see sustainability issues in cases where governments don't secure any economic benefits in the early years of a project, even before projects become profitable. So while we see that there's a real challenge in the green hydrogen sector about profitability, certainly in the early years, we think that it's important for governments to secure some at least modest economic benefits in the early years and to build in mechanisms to secure upside if and when projects become profitable. And a final set of comments then about anticipating potential challenges. Of course, companies put a lot of time and effort into anticipating the way projects might evolve over time, and we think governments need to take the same kind of role. It's very easy to overemphasize in the early days the incentivization of investments without thinking about the sharing of benefits over the longer term. We see real risks around the overstatement of non-revenue benefits like jobs and small and medium-sized enterprises. Of course, the green hydrogen sector could be different, but we see real challenges in looking backwards in the oil and gas sector in particular, where in many cases those benefits have not fully materialized. We would see concerns around stabilization clauses in contracts. There's more to be said about that, but again, time-bound and limited is probably best from a government perspective. And finally, we think that governments should anticipate the kinds of risks that we have seen in other sectors and make sure that they have mitigation strategies in place. So I'll bring my comments to a close simply by saying that multi-decade projects require durable contracting frameworks and durable fiscal terms. It's an exciting moment where a new sector is being born. And fit-for-purpose fiscal regimes are going to be essential in order to make those deals sustainable. Thank you.
Don, that's absolutely wonderful. And my goodness, we've crammed in a lot of really important experiences over a long time there. Before you go, you said about 2 minutes from the end that you thought that although profitability might be an issue in the beginning, and in particular, maybe when we see the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is having in some other parts of the world, at the same time, you made the point that you think that governments need to earn a bit of money, have some income early in the early parts of the project. How do you think that is best achieved?
Well, that's a big question, and I know that there's a tendency to want answers. I think that in almost every jurisdiction, careful analysis is required before we move too quickly to that. But we do see that sustainability of projects and public opinion does depend on government securing some kind of early year revenue benefits. Of course, green hydrogen is different because, as Ines commented at the start, it's not the sale of a non-renewable asset. Nevertheless, multi-billion-dollar investments in developing countries create societal expectations. And those expectations need to be met for contracting terms to be durable. In our paper, we looked at a unit-based royalty. It can be very modest. What we have seen from the extractive sector, and Jonas, you know it well from your experience in EITI, is that in many cases, we see large projects paying absolutely nothing. And that's a real challenge. The payments don't need to be large, but I think that the durability of contracts does require at least some modest benefits to the host government right from the start. Thank you.
I think thank you, Don. I think that's a surely very important message here, what you said, for the durability of the contracts. Not large, but there should be something there. And I think is the one thing we also need to take away from this conversation is to feed that message to the large multilateral development banks that have a key role in the in funding, but also in structuring many of these arrangements. Let's move on. I don't know, I can't see Ernst. Are you out there somewhere? There you are, Ernst Müller. You've been a key supporter and contributor to this project with one of the law firms for the whole time. You're calling in from South Africa. Would you like to comment briefly on what you've heard so far today?
Thank you very much, Jonas, and the Green Hydrogen team for inviting me to join today's conversation. I agree with all of the speakers that this is a very exciting space to be in. It's a terribly exciting sector. I do a lot of work in the mining sector across Africa, and many mining companies at this point in time are premising a lot of their ambitions to become net zero by 2050 on some of the ambitions of the green hydrogen sector as well, especially if we think about mines that are active in the iron space, iron ore mining, etc. So I think that that's, yes, I think that that's right. I also agree with Don that it is very important that we work together with the different sectors and that we appreciate that although this is a nascent industry in which we're engaged in, that there are a lot of lessons that have been learned from the mining sector, from the oil and gas sector, from the existing renewable space and energy in general, and that we shouldn't make the mistake of not learning from their lessons, but rather that we should capitalize on that and ensure that we proceed at a rapid pace to get everything related to green hydrogen up and running.
That's great, Ernst. A little bit of specificity we must try to squeeze in here. Take what Don, for example, said, and indeed what we heard from Mahmoud. He talked about how to get pricing right, or how to get towards finding a risk sharing when you don't have a benchmark price. Do you have a view on that?
I must admit, as the only lawyer on the panel, or one of the lawyers on the panel, that's not an area of expertise to me. But what I can say though is that we cannot overemphasize the importance of offtake agreements in the South African space, where South Africa is obviously one of the 6 countries, along with Egypt, that's really trying to establish a green hydrogen sector. At the end of the day, the success of any project will depend on the ability to secure offtake agreements from the outset. That will obviously dictate the finance models that are available to the project developers. And we appreciate that it will take a blend of financing options to get these projects off the ground. If we look at South Africa's own commercialization strategy for green hydrogen, about 1/3 of the money we anticipate will come from development finance institutions, and the rest will have to be provided by commercial banks. And that's all of that turns on the economics of the specific projects, which of course depend on the prices at the end of the day.
But you said you gave a very interesting answer here still. Ernst, in terms of getting now, and you by all means stick to the South African context, what do you see as the sort of main hurdles or challenges to lifting those projects over FID?
From South Africa, if we read the commercialization strategy, again, I think the key impediment at this point in time, also listening to some of the comments that were made by the development finance institutions and the different stakeholders at last year's Green Hydrogen seminar in Cape Town, it really depends on the legal regime, which in 2 words come down to certainty and predictability. I think, again, Don touched on that with these projects, we think about decades. Often politicians think in 5-year re-election cycles. And the issue there is we have to bring those 2 dots together to make sure that we create environments that are conducive towards attracting foreign direct investment, specifically in emerging markets and developing economies. And the easiest way that you can achieve that is by establishing a legal framework that promotes certainty and predictability. I think the lessons that we've learned from difficult jurisdictions such as the DRC is that even if there are difficult operating environments, if you create circumstances where at least it's predictable what the outcome will be, then project developers can take that risk into their appreciation of the circumstances and make informed decisions. From a South African perspective, and I think perhaps even globally, because we don't have well-established green hydrogen legal frameworks, it's difficult for project developers to understand how they should manage certain elements, such as risks arising from health and safety, because we're still exploring the molecular and chemical properties of hydrogen. That then, of course, translates into the infrastructure that we need and the impact that it has on communities, which is a topic that's very close to my heart. At the end of the day, for example, if we want to make sure that projects run properly, we need to establish well-founded social licenses to operate. That means that you must provide sufficient information to communities that they have an appreciation of the nature and extent of the projects and how the projects will affect their ability to conduct their own livelihood patterns. All of this, again, comes down to a legal regime. If we have a framework that paints the picture, it provides a very strong platform from which governments and project developers can work together to establish a thriving sector.
Thank you. That's incredibly comprehensive. While you spoke, Birgitte's hand rose, and then we have a question from about Egypt. But Birgitte, did you want to come in on what Ernst was just talking about?
Yeah, so I just really want to add to Ernst because I really agree with this. We have been drafting offtake contracts for Norwegian stakeholders here in Norway, but also with due regard also to the rest on the world market. And one of the problems we're seeing, first of all, in Europe, this is now ongoing. For instance, the carbon and the CBAM, as I call it, has now just been established that hydrogen will be part of it. This was not proposed by the Commission, and it's still discussions under the ETS with this. So it's a moving target, and it makes it very difficult to draft those contracts, which we have to do, and we have been also contributing that to the regulatory group. So, but I do think, and I think we are all in the same boat, which makes it it's not like discrimination because everybody has the same insecurity, which actually helps us drafting this contract because the industry must take some chances out there. And at the same time, I do think by the spring, at least from the European side of view, there are some more calm regional legislation that we can refer to. At the same time, as we saw at your very good meeting about the additionality from Europe, it's a lot of questions coming up again, which we see that are not sorted. So, but I think the legal issues, it's something that you really have to have in the front line together, of course, with the financing, but they are quite sticking together.
Thank you very much, Birgitte. And I love the fact that you said that industry has to take the challenges, opportunities, not share the risks. Now we had a question about Egypt. I don't know if Mohammed might want to, or or Mahmoud, whichever. Is it doable to finalize the 9 framework agreements from the 32 MOUs without publishing the national strategy for green hydrogen? Would either of the two of you pick that up? And then we have a question from you, Mohammed, which are the main risks? And so I guess that's something that we'll see if anyone else wants to come on to address.
Jonas, can you repeat the question, please?
So Mohammed, the question is it doable to finalize and execute at least the 9 framework agreements without publishing the strategy?
Yeah, because the framework agreement are just that, right? They establish the framework, for that initial impetus for investment, the land, where it's located, where the sponsors are, the payments on the land, the kind of interconnections that are required, the infrastructure that is required to be put in place. And now the frameworks agreement themselves take into consideration that further incentives may be in place, further strategies may be in place. But you know, what's in the framework agreement can be considered as the first step for that kind of global strategy that Egypt is putting in place. So they don't go into a level of detail that would contradict once you have the definitive agreements, or that you know, would take away from those definitive agreements. They're not structured in that manner.
What kind of detail do you see as an obvious next phase following the framework agreements?
Well, that's the thing. It's, as I said at the beginning, it would depend on what the definitive agreements exactly are, you know, and that would depend on how each project is commercially structured. If there will be offtake agreements, what will those be? Will those be to third parties, or will those be to, as some of the projects are, to integrated kind of businesses? And depending on the sectors of the business, this would be the main driver, right? The underlying commercials, and we're not at that stage yet. The step from the framework agreement was to make sure that land for the solar power plant is there, and land for electrolyzer is there. Clarity on and stability for those lands, and obviously to, as a preliminary step, to grant the investors the ability to go do the surveys and ensure that the land is fit for purpose. So it really resolves more around the land and around the infrastructure that the government will be providing, and around the support and assistance that the government will be providing in terms of permitting, rather than, you know, the detailed commercial projects and their you know, salient features.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And maybe we should also have clarified that there is an Egyptian national strategy that is available, but there are aspects that need to be fully gazetted. I think that's a fair summary, is it not, Mohammed?
As you know, that we are now still in the final stage for preparing the strategy. During the COP27, we already published a strategic framework for our strategy, but we are still now, as you know, that to have a clear strategy with all targets, defined target, it is not an easy, and we are working with the consultant for getting the final one, and I am sure that it will be published very soon.
Thank you for clarifying that. We've got time for a couple of more questions. We have one from Morocco, from Mr. Shukri. How can the World Bank contribute to overcome the cost gap of the technology? On that, you will have seen in the program that Carolina was due to contribute on behalf of the World Bank. She had a medical thing to attend, so she was deeply regretful that she couldn't join and contribute today. She's part of the central hydrogen team that have recently launched the Hydrogen for Development partnership within the World Bank. I don't want to speak on behalf of the bank, and I don't know if anyone is representing the bank, other than two things. That program is providing technical assistance and support to a number of governments, just like some other development banks and so on are doing, helping with drafting strategies and so on and so forth. The other part is, of course, that the big development banks are likely to play a very big role in contributing to the financing and to various forms of concessionary blended finance in this space. And here we are actually working together with a number of these banks at the moment on looking a little bit, exploring the detail of some of those finance solutions. We've got a colleague, I think, on the call today, Tove Strauss, who's drafting a paper in that space. I don't know, is there anything very quickly you want to mention, Tove?
Well, actually, I think it's a bit too early to say. I'm still investigating the options, but I think one thing that has come out is the importance of collaboration between the various arms of the World Bank and also the various multilateral development banks in providing this kind of financing for large scale investments. But yeah, I think it's a bit maybe too early to say.
Thank you very much for that. And either if Tove or someone in the team can drop Tove's email address in chat. And if anyone is interested in that aspect, be in touch with either Ines or Tove, and we'd be very keen to hear from everyone what the financial structures involving these blended solutions may eventually look like. Here we have a very interesting question from Mr. Shu. Can additionality be addressed in contracting and how? Joe Williams, my own colleague, is this one you want to comment on?
Can you rephrase the question, Jonas?
I don't know, sorry. The question is, can additionality be addressed in contracting and how? If I try to just on the spot, I think it's a very interesting question. So what we're talking about here is fundamentally if the production of green hydrogen or its derivatives, such as green ammonia, is being produced and you have grid connectivity, how do you ensure that the power used is green? And if we look, for example, at how the green hydrogen standard, which is the standard that our own organization has developed with a group of companies, including Envision in China, for example, we are essentially requiring of the hosting government and developers to demonstrate that the energy used is green. There are, of course, also on the buying side in rules, for example, set out by the EU, quite strict requirements being drafted that look likely to, after 28, require essentially hourly matching. So I guess for a number of places, there is there will be a very strong desire to make sure that one meets those sorts of standards.
Maybe to complement on that slightly, Jonas, I think it's a very interesting question on, whether you can include additionality within contracting versus within regulation. Most of the discussions we've been having recently on additionality relate to additionality through the EU's REFINBO regulation, potentially in the US under the IRA. But theoretically, there's no reason why a contract, for example, an off-taker contract, can't require that green hydrogen to have been produced with some form of additional renewable electricity. And in fact, there's a company in the UK, Octopus Hydrogen, which is a sort of essentially a subsidiary of the large energy grid energy operator, and they have decided that any green hydrogen that they produce will be produced with additional electricity. So the UK government is not requiring additionality. That's nowhere to be seen in the UK government's low carbon strategy. But this company is saying the green hydrogen you buy from us will have been produced with additional renewable resources. And I think there could be a whole market for this sort of essentially a premium for companies and customers who actually want the type of hydrogen that has no impact on the overall grid. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space, but we're beginning to see that come out.
Fantastic. Birgitte, your hand came up again.
Just very shortly, you have to, if you want to have subsidies in order to be claiming you're green. So whether you put it in a contract or not, doesn't matter, but we put it in the contracts because it's a reference to the regulatory framework, because it goes back to the clean energy package, which addresses again to the additionality. So in order to be green and in order to get subsidies, you need to provide that. So in our contract, before the additionality was decided, we actually had a reference to it. We also have a reference to state aid. How do you share? Like if you go into a market where it's flooded with state aid and you come as a producer, it's all these regulatory regimes. I think it's very good to talk about them in these different offtake contracts, because these are going to be your friends for a long, long time. And you need to address those issues in open air, because those will be the law. And it's actually more or less the law.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. We're coming to the end, more or less, Ines. Ines, this is your brainchild. Do you have any quick comments, or otherwise, should we show everyone what we planned for the coming webinars?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously, yeah, exciting, because we're talking about this in sort of broad terms, and you know, it's just such a fast moving space where it's so exciting to actually have you know, people from government, from the law firms that are really figuring out the details here, from the private sector, from civil society. So we're just really excited to have kicked off the conversation, and look forward to kind of getting a bit you know, under the headlines and dig a bit deeper in the coming weeks. I will share quickly the schedule, but we'll also send this around to everyone, and we hope that you join, that you follow up with questions also in advance of the webinars, and don't hesitate to be in touch if you have any feedback or want to stay involved in this project. We need to sort of share and work together to move quickly towards the sort of sustainable green hydrogen economy. So yeah, we're excited, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Ines. And I guess we don't quite know where we will go, so we're very happy to take the conversation where your questions leads us, and be influenced by that, like we've just seen over the last 10 minutes or so. Clearly, we might want to return to discuss some of the detail of additionality requirements, for example. Anyone, any quick comments or questions before we close? No. Once again, thank you all. Thanks in particular to the 7 law firms that have provided pro bono contributions. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to all of you, and we will be in touch.